You set foot on foreign soil. Only this land isn't ruled by any country or government. In this land we celebrate music. In this land we celebrate games. In this land we celebrate those who compose video game music. Welcome to the VG Embassy. Welcome and thanks for tuning in to another episode of the VG Embassy. This is a show centered around video game music and the amazing online community of fans and podcasters that enjoy it. My name's Ed, and on each episode I'll take the role of Prime VGM Minister and invite a guest VG Ambassador onto the show to share with us their own video game music culture. Or, like today, I'll share a part of my culture on a solo show. Ladies and gentlemen, we are back again with another solo show. This one's going to be kind of an in-depth music history show. We're going to be looking at a series that is extremely long-lived in both the arcades and for home consoles and has quite a pedigree for featuring the musical talents of a whole bunch of prominent composers over the years. So I'm not sure what to call the series itself. Lots of places on the internet call it the 1940X series. A lot of places call it the 1940 series. Anyways, it's the series of Capcom shoot-em-ups that started with the game 1942. Games afterwards were kind of yearly increments. 1943, there's 1944, there's actually one called 19XDX, which is a little bit interesting. But I want to spend some time taking a look at the games and the histories and the chronology of the music. One of the really cool things about the series is that it appeared on so many different systems that each iteration of the game kind of takes on a whole new musical character. And you get a good look at the progress of video game music technology with each new title released. A little bit of top of the show business to get to first. I do want to announce the return of Embassy Exclusive, the Patreon show, now that quarantine rules are being lifted and myself and Todd and Joe have all gotten our vaccines. We feel it's safe to gather in person again and start recording shows. So if everything goes smoothly, today is May the 21st, 2021. It should be today that we are recording next episode of Embassy Exclusives. So if you are a Patreon member, you can look forward to that. Make sure that you're still subscribed to the RSS feed on Patreon. If you're not a Patreon member, take a look at our Patreon page. We have a link to it in the show notes on thevgembassy.com. And starting at a tier of $3 per month, you'll have access to all of our previous Embassy exclusive shows, plus all of our monthly shows going forward. I know I've been doing a lot of solo shows lately. It's just been because of my crazy schedule. I've been recording a lot of these kind of in segments when I have the time to. I do have at least 2 shows planned with guests, and hopefully those will be the next 2 shows. We've already got playlists down and topics going, so I'm looking forward to sharing those with you, hopefully within the next couple months or so. All right, so let's take a look at, I'm going to call it the 1940X series, because that's personally how I have been referring to it in my head. Capcom only released one shoot-'em-up before 1942, the first game in the series, and that was called Vulgus. and it was a sci-fi shoot 'em up. As most shoot 'em ups go, you don't really get a lot of historical shoot 'em ups. You tend to get fantasy, but more so you'll get science fiction, spaceships flying through space, alien planets, giant alien enemies. I guess it's just easier to suspend your disbelief when you've got more of a sci-fi setting. So it was kind of a bold move for Capcom to create a shoot 'em up that was based on actual historical events, especially those of World War II. It was a little bit controversial at the time because here was a Japanese company who decided that they wanted to create a game about an American pilot who the player takes control of, racing from a US-controlled territory to Tokyo to destroy the Japanese enemy. So it was kind of like the Japanese were presenting themselves as the bad guy. And so there was a little controversy about that, which we'll go into as we talk throughout the show. They actually ended up having to make some changes to some games specifically because of that. But the game spawned tons and tons of sequels and was very popular, and a whole bunch of clones and ripoffs too, which I'll kind of briefly touch on as we go throughout the show. So let's get into the first piece of music. Now, I'm going to warn everyone, if you're here for awesome music, there will be awesome music in this show. Those of you who are familiar with 1942 know at least the NES version of the game, the music is maybe a little bit difficult to listen to for a long period of time. I'm not going to play these songs forever, but in historical context, we're going to play the music from the first game simply because I want there to be a full contextual procession from the very early stuff to the end of the game's series as of this recording. Once we get that out of the way, once we get into, the end of the 1942 music and the beginning of 1943, you'll start hearing music which is much more pleasing to the ear. But to start things off, we're going to listen to the main BGM from the game 1942, and that was released in the arcade in 1984. Old games. This was composed by Ayako Mori, and like I said, you may not enjoy this music that much, but that's okay, I don't either. So let's take a quick listen, we'll be right back. See, just a quick 20-second loop. That was the main BGM from the game 1942 from the arcade, which was released in 1984, composed by Ayako Mori. Obvious that they wanted to go for a kind of a military parade kind of a theme. The interesting thing is that it just basically sounds like a series of sound effects which don't really move up or down in scale at all. Mixed with the game sound effects, it just basically sounds like a cacophony of different sounds while you're fighting, and the sound chip was so limited in scope and power that you would actually kind of override some of the musical sound effects with your gameplay sound effects. So the audio in this game is just kind of chaotic. To cap that all off, the game is 32 levels long, and each level is pretty long. This game was created to basically eat your quarters in the arcade. So this was the music that played throughout the entire game, and so you were probably going to be hearing this in your sleep if you sat down and played through the whole thing. I think it takes a good hour to an hour and a half to finish this game. I've never done it myself. If I would probably turn the sound down and listen to some music in its place. But like I said, it's presented for historical context. It is presented so we know where we've come from, so that when we get to the really good stuff, we can appreciate how far the music in this series has gone. As far as the story of the game goes, it says in the arcade write-up from the sales pamphlet Receiving an emergency order of departure, the P-38 Lightning flies away from the aircraft carrier. It's the beginning of a long battle journey. 1942 is set in the Pacific theater of World War II, and the goal is to reach Tokyo and destroy the entire Japanese air fleet. The player controls a pilot called Super Ace, who pilots the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. The P-38 Lightning becomes the kind of, it's like the Vic Viper of the Gradius series. They are kind of synonymous with each other. The P-38 Lightning appears in almost all of the other 1940X series games going forward, so it's kind of cool that this is the birthplace. And the Lockheed P-38 Lightning is a real plane, too, so it's actually kind of cool that a video game star, quote-unquote, also has a real-life counterpart. As far as gameplay goes, super easy 8-way joystick, one button to shoot and one button to perform loops. So I guess the interesting thing about this is that most shoot 'em ups will have a shoot button and then a bomb button. The bomb button will usually cause massive area of effect damage or clear the entire screen, something like that. The loop button you would be able to use 3 times per stage, and essentially your plane would loop into the sky. It would get like really big on the screen for a little bit, and during that time you're invincible, but you also couldn't shoot. So it was more like a get out of a tough situation button, more or less, and not so much a destroy your enemy button. So you really had to be strategic when you're using your loop button, and having only 3 of them and not being able to get any extra as you go means you really had to use it smartly. The other thing you could do is get power-ups which raise your plane's firepower, or you can get these little side fighters, 2 smaller planes that basically they were your wingmen, so they would hang out on either side of your ship and they would shoot upward as well, so you'd widen your area of attack in front of you. Very, very useful, and those could take damage and die as well, so you kind of had to protect them from getting hit as well as yourself as you're flying through these enemies. So I mentioned that the music was composed by Ayako Mori, and that's kind of significant because I'm not sure how or why, but they named one of the major bosses in the game, which appears several times as you play it. It's called the Ayako, so maybe the programmer was kind of smitten by her and wanted to name a video game character after her. I'm not sure, but there are 2 pieces of music named after her in the game's soundtrack, and these play while you are fighting the Ayako. So let's take a listen to Ayako BGM and Ayako Destruction, again from the arcade version of the game in 1984, composed by Ayako Mori. See, some cute little tunes. That drumming and farting song, the main BGM, is broken up once in a while whenever the Ayako appears, and it's funny, I wonder what Ayako Mori thought about writing her own funeral music, you know, the music that plays when the ship named after her gets destroyed. It's kind of funny. You know, it's short and sweet. The music sounds, it's like a very simple wavetable chip. It sounds like, early NES music, maybe Sega Master System, that kind of thing. I guess enough just to break up the music for a little bit so the main BGM doesn't drive you absolutely insane. The game was also ported to the NES. Most people probably remember this game from the NES. I don't know how popular it was in the arcades, but I know it was a very early NES game. It was released in 1985, and so at that point there weren't a whole lot of games to pick from, and so a lot of people probably ended up with this title in their collection. And the music has improved a little bit. There are really only 2 pieces of music for the NES game. One is a conversion of the main BGM from the arcade, and the other is a stage clear tune. So again, for historical context, let's listen to the NES versions of those tunes, again composed by Ayako Mori. I swear to God, guys, I'm not trolling you for this episode. We will get to the really good stuff quite soon. But again, it just goes to show how very, very simple the music was for this game. And, don't take that to mean that Mori isn't a talented composer. Keep in mind the years here. So Capcom's arcade hardware and the NES were both brand new, and the sound drivers were probably terrible compared to what was available later on. She also went on to compose memorable soundtracks for the Capcom arcade and the NES systems. She composed Ghosts and Goblins, Gunsmoke, Sidearms, Trojan, a couple of other ones. So she had, genuinely decent soundtracks under her belt. She is still in the games industry today after she left Capcom. She went on to work for Sony, and so she currently does package and booklet design work for physical game boxes and soundtrack CDs. So, physical game and soundtrack collectors probably have a lot to thank her for, because she's designed probably a lot of the boxes that are sitting on your shelves if you've gotten anything that Sony Entertainment has put out. That's pretty cool. We're going to stick with 1942 for just a little while longer, but this is where stuff starts to get good. So we're going to listen to one of the European ports of the game, because they have brand new soundtracks, which I really enjoy. European developers were extremely proud of what they could do with the sound chips in their computers, especially the Commodore 64. So Mark Cooksey composed new tunes for the Commodore 64 ports, and a simplified version of those tunes were released on the ZX Spectrum port. So let's take a listen to the title and gameplay theme from 1942 on the Commodore 64. This one came out a couple years later in 1987, and I really like this tune. So let's take a listen, and you guys can finally unplug your ears for this one. Alright, see, so that was definitely more palatable for the eardrums. Still had kind of a militaristic feel, but this was more like a, victory of planes soaring through the sky on their way home from a successful mission or something like that. It had more of a fanfare kind of a feel. Mark Cooksey was an employee of Elite. They were the guys that ported this particular game from Capcom over to the C64. Coincidentally, Cooksey is most recognized for his really good Ghosts and Goblins Commodore 64 soundtrack, which was also originally composed by Ayako Mori. So that's kind of a cool little parallel there. This music was evidently pretty popular amongst gamers in Europe at the time, because I'm not going to play it on the show, but there's a hack of this game for the arcade which incorporates this Commodore 64 tune as the background music recomposed for the arcade sound chip. So that's really cool that a lot of people recognize this as kind of like the definitive 1942 soundtrack. We're going to listen to one more track from the Commodore 64 version of the game. This is the Game Over theme. I really like it. It's very chill and very wistful. It's kind of a different side of Mark Cooksey's composition. Be right back. Talk about a change of mood, right? I feel like if I died in this game, I'd be too sad to pick the thing back up and keep playing. Just a very slow, plodding atmosphere. I love the SID chip and the C64 because it can sound so full and rich. Like, it's an extremely textured sound chip, and Cooksey uses it to great effect here. And I love the way it takes forever for his melody lines to resolve. It's like a full minute before you're finally at the end of the initial melody run, and you're like, oh my god, when am I gonna get closure? Kind of feels like, the game over. Your family's never gonna see closure because Super Ace has plunged into the water, never to be seen again. Poor dude. Well, we've got one more 1942 game to get through. This is an oddity, perhaps the first background music from a Java mobile game to ever be played on a video game music podcast. If I'm wrong, let me know, but I don't remember any. Anyways, there was a remake of 1942 released in 2009-2010 era called Joint Strike, which was released on the Xbox 360 and the PS3, and we're going to get to that at the very end of the show, but along with that, there was a mobile remake of the game as well, which was released on Java, obviously here, and iOS. The iOS version of the game shared the same soundtrack with Joint Strike, but First Strike had a pretty rockin' background tune for its gameplay. No idea who composed the tune. There's no credits in the game, but I really enjoy it and I really wanted to share it. So let's take a listen to 1942, First Strike, released in 2009 for mobile phones. Isn't that cool? Like, imagine that blaring from your flip phone in the mid-2000s as you play this game. I thought that was really neat. I like the very Capcom-ish soundtrack. Like, it sounds really familiar. Like, I feel like parts of this music were in another game that I've played, but I can't quite put my finger on it. Like, it feels a little Street Fighter, maybe a little Mega Man X. I'm wondering if an actual Capcom composer that worked on those older titles also wrote the soundtrack to this one. It's a little muddy. I recorded this from a Java emulator, so might sound slightly different coming out of an actual phone speaker. I'm sure it's a little bit less bassy and a little more tinny, but again, I thought it was just a really cool kind of artifact from the 1940X series that would be cool to share on this show. Unfortunately, both the Commodore 64 and the Java mobile version suffered from bad control. The C64 version used either the keyboard or the joystick, and the movement was extremely delayed, so you'd have to really get used to the input lag in order to get good at the game. The First Strike mobile game had two options. So on the Java version of the game, you could, use your phone's keypad to move your plane around. And of course, that's not a very good way to control a shoot 'em up. The ship would shoot automatically, so you didn't have to worry about holding a button down to fire, but, it's just not a great way to play a game. On the iOS version of the game, you had two options. You could use your finger to drag the plane around the screen, which is a great way to play shoot 'em ups, especially modern shoot 'em ups on like iPad and iPhone control great. For this, it was like you would drag your finger on the screen, but the plane could only move in 8 directions, so even if you moved at like north-northwest, it would still just go northwest. It was pretty janky. The other option was to use the phone's accelerometer, so you would tilt the phone to move the plane around. I can't even say it with a straight face. I cannot imagine tilting my phone around to play a shoot 'em up game. That must have been the most frustrating experience in the world. I saw one YouTube video of somebody demonstrating this game with the tilt controls, and they were like, "What am I doing?" Needless to say, that brand of control did not persist into later mobile shoot 'em up games, that's for sure. Alright, so 1942, as we learned, very successful, multiple ports all over the place. I don't think I listed out all of the consoles that it ended up on. So it came out on the Arcade, the NES, the MSX, the C64, the Game Boy Color, the FM7, the ZX Spectrum, the Amstrad CPC, the Sharp X1, on Nintendo's Virtual Console, the Saturn and the PlayStation, and PlayStation 2 and Xbox, all as part of the Capcom Classics collection. So those were just emulations of the original arcade game. But, 1942 was all over the place. Very well loved, soundtrack aside, and a huge influence on shoot 'em up games going forward. So successful that they decided to turn the game into a series. So Capcom next released in 1987, 1943, The Battle of Midway. Not Midway, the guys that made like NBA Jam, of course. This was originally released in the arcade and then ported to the Amiga, the Amstrad CPC, the Atari ST, the Commodore 64, the NES, and the ZX Spectrum, and then was later included on Capcom Classics collections on the PS3 and the Xbox 360. Alright, so the arcade version was composed by Kumi Yamaga, and this was a game with some real dedicated music, different soundtracks for different levels, actual polyphonic melodies. It wasn't your typical 1942 fare. And the game was set in, again, the Pacific theater of World War II, 1 year after the original game. You need to attack the Japanese air fleet that bombed the American aircraft carrier and pursue all Japanese air and sea forces through 16 stages of play until you get to the Japanese battleship Yamato. There are 11 air-to-sea battle stages and 5 aerial battle stages in clouds, so at least they're varying their backgrounds a little bit. In the previous game, all 32 stages took place over a very static ocean view. It was a very blue game. This one at least kind of mixes it up with some different backgrounds to look at. So let's take a listen to Anti-Ship Battle A from the arcade version of 1943, The Battle of Midway, again composed by Kumi Yamaga. Oh man, I'm kind of an idiot. Alright, so that was Anti-Ship Battle A from 1943, The Battle of Midway, released in the arcade in 1987, composed by Kumi Yamaga. And playing them back to back, which I hadn't done before, I just realized that the Java tune I just played was basically a cover song of this tune. And I'm sitting there like, I feel like I've heard this music before when I'm playing it on the show. So there you go. This tune is actually really popular and is kind of like the defining theme of the 1940X series. We're going to hear another version of it at the very end of the show when we get to the Xbox 360 and PS3 remake of 1942. And it's a wonderfully orchestrated version of this tune. The game itself is great. It's an improvement on 1942 on all fronts. For one, you have, like I said, more variations in stages. The enemies are better drawn. There's more variations in enemies. It's a little bit faster. It's a little bit smoother. You get some different weapons to play with now, a 3-way shot, a rapid-fire weapon, and a shotgun, which is a very short-range weapon, but can shoot down the bullets that the enemies are shooting at you, so it's more of a defensive weapon, which is really cool for strategy. And instead of getting shot down with one bullet, now you have a health bar. The trade-off for that is that you only get one ship per quarter. So I personally prefer it because I dislike having to start a stage over every single time I get shot. Having that health bar is nice because it allows you to keep playing even though you get hit. You get that little period of invincibility after you get hit, and then you can just move on. This also has some nice full-screen graphics that show you flying away from the enemy that you've destroyed at the end of each stage. So there are some really nice graphical touches. They've also given you a bomb instead of a loop now, And the bomb is actually different depending on whether you're flying over the sea or whether you're flying in the clouds. If you're up in the sky, lightning will strike all the enemies that are on the screen, and if you're down flying along the ocean, a giant tsunami wave will come and crash through all the enemies. So that's pretty cool. I like that they're actually adding a lot more variety to this, especially when there doesn't need to be. I think they maybe had more time to work on this, and the programmers were getting more familiar with the arcade hardware and just being able to add more fun, cool stuff. This also introduced the ability to pick up the POW power-ups, which I don't think means prisoners of war. I think it means power, because when you pick them up, it will refill some of your health if you've lost it, which is great. So if you can manage that, you can stay alive for a heck of a lot longer. You still pilot the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, and the unfortunate thing about your fuel gauge is that it decreases over time, which kind of reminds me of games like Metamorphic Force, which was by Konami, where your health is draining constantly and you need to keep picking up health, like Adventure Island or something like that. Those kind of games really bug me and they stress me out to no end. So it's nice when you're playing at home on MAME, or if you've got an arcade collection where you can just keep feeding quarters in to keep your health up. I'm much more of a fan of that kind of thing. I feel like it's really cheap when health just drains for no particular reason. I guess if you're flying a plane, though, come to think of it, it's a little more realistic because you can look at it as the fuel in your plane and it's being used up as you're flying over the ocean. So, hey, maybe I can give them a pass for this one. As far as the composition goes, this is a really nice tune, very textured chords, very heroic sounding. It's a very memorable, catchy loop. Not very long, but very competent, very easy to listen to. Kumi Yamaga, kind of like Ayako Mori, only worked for Capcom for a couple of years. While she was there, she composed the soundtrack to Section Z for the NES. She was credited as Yamachan, and she was credited as Jungle Kumi on this soundtrack, and the arcade version of 1943 Kai, which we'll be hearing from in a little bit. We're also going to listen to a piece of music from the NES port of this game, and Yoshihiro Sakaguchi arranged the music for this one. Definitely feels like a Capcom NES soundtrack. I'm sure you'll hear some familiar chords and tones. So let's take a listen to the Air Battle Theme A from 1943, The Battle of Midway. This came out on the NES in 1988, again composed by Kumi Yamaga and arranged by Yoshihiro Sakaguchi. Yeah, I definitely hear some Mega Man in there, maybe a little bit of Bionic Commando. That was Anti-Ship Battle A from 1943, The Battle of Midway, released on the NES in 1988, composed by Kumi Yamaga and arranged by Yoshihiro Sakaguchi. Kind of a sad piece. I don't know, it's a little bit down-tempo for a soaring shoot-'em-up like this one. Aside from the Air Battle A theme, which we just played from the arcade version, most of the music in this game is kind of dour sounding. Maybe that was just how Kumi Yamaga wanted to compose it. Maybe it was just how it ended up sounding on the rudimentary FM chip that they used. I think this was a YM2203 in the arcade version. I like it. It's just not as positive as a lot of shoot 'em up themes tend to be. Like if this were a Mega Man song, if we're going like Capcom NES, I would probably fit this in as like a Dr. Wily stage, something like that, where things are getting super dangerous. So the game changed quite a bit for the NES version. And again, this was kind of something that Capcom started to do with their arcade to NES conversions. You know, like, again, I'll take Bionic Commando as an example. The arcade version of Bionic Commando was much more simple, and they almost added like quasi-RPG adventure elements to the NES version to kind of flesh the gameplay out. And they did that here too, not to the same extent, but they added a feature where you could upgrade your plane as you went from stage to stage. So you could find bamboo sprout and firefly icons on the stage as you flew throughout them on the NES version, and when you find them, they would give you points that you can use to upgrade certain aspects of your plane. So you can give yourself more offensive power, more defensive power, you could raise your energy level, you could make your special weapon more effective, or make your special weapon last longer. So you could kind of configure your plane any way you wanted to, so by the end of the game, you are kind of outfitted in a way that benefits your style of gameplay the most. I thought that was really cool, and it does add some replayability, because then you could kind of experiment with differently configured planes, and the game might feel different depending on, you know, how you're applying those points as you go throughout the game. The bamboo sprouts and fireflies aren't always readily visible on the levels, so you would have to go kind of hunt for them as well. So I thought that was pretty cool. This was around the time where the game was becoming big enough that it was starting to cause a little bit of controversy in the media. So in Japan, the NES version was retitled 1943, The Battle of Valhalla, and they kept the game mostly the same, but they took away the references of the US versus Japan. They removed all of the references to the Imperial Japanese Navy, and all the bosses' names were changed to the names of the emperors from Romance of the Three Kingdoms. So they gave it more of like a fantasy bent, even though it was all kind of historically accurate ships and planes that you were fighting against. They just didn't want to delineate the two factions that were fighting as US and Japanese. So I thought that was kind of cool. I mean, it was a good way to keep the gameplay intact without getting people angry. So another thing that Capcom liked to do when their series became popular was to enhance the gameplay. This was especially notable on the Street Fighter II series, where there were multiple iterations of Street Fighter II. Obviously, Street Fighter Championship Edition, Street Fighter Turbo, Super Street Fighter 2, you know, for a while we felt that maybe there would never ever be a Street Fighter 3, and they would just keep going through different iterations of 2. Well, there was one new iteration of 1943 that came out called 1943 Kai. Kai is kind of a universal Japanese word that means revision or change or update. It's kind of like a rehash of something. So 1943 Kai was based on the original 1943 game, of course, but it had enhanced graphics, gameplay, and brand new music. Capcom threw nearly their entire composition team at the soundtrack, with contributions from several well-known composers. So we're going to take a listen to Air Battle C from 1943 Kai Midway Kaisen. This was released in the arcade in 1987. Take a listen to who was on this composing team. Harumi Fujita, Hiroshige Tonomura, Junko Tamiya, Kumi Yamaga, Manami Matsumai, Takeshi Tataishi, Tamayo Kawamoto, and they credited John Philip Sousa for music from his marching selections. So yeah, this is a great soundtrack. This game was also released on the PC Engine, and I feel like that soundtrack is even better than the arcade, but I really like this one too. So let's listen to Air Battle C, and we'll be right back. What a jazzy tune. And actually, as I was listening to this, I did a little bit of digging and found individual composer credits, believe it or not. So that was Air Battle C from 1943 Kai Midway Kaisen, released on the arcade in 1987. This particular track was composed by Harumi Fujita. This arcade hardware included two YM2203 chips, so it doubled the musical channels and capabilities of the original 1943 arcade hardware. Also, it added an AY8910 chip for the sound effects so as to not limit the amount of channels those FM chips could use for music. So, considering the fact that there were so many composers that worked on this, so many prominent composers, I really feel like Capcom was like, hey, let's make this kind of a musical showcase. We want to enhance the graphics, we want to enhance the gameplay, let's show off what our music composition staff could do. They really knocked it out of the park with this. There are a couple of differences from 1943 Kai to the original to make it immediately recognizable as a different game. They replaced the Lockheed P-38 Lightning with a Boeing Stearman E-75 biplane. And I believe this is the only game in the series where the P-38 is not available to play as. All of the game's graphics were edited. The enemies in the backgrounds were now sporting different palettes. They reduced the number of stages from 16 to 10, which potentially could have been to save on memory if they were upping the graphical fidelity of the game. They may have needed to reduce the number of background tiles for 6 stages in order to fit all of that extra stuff in. They added a new special weapon called the laser, which would pierce through enemies regardless of who you were shooting. It would go all the way to the top of the screen and damage everything in its path and not just stop at the first hit like your regular bullets do. They also increased the difficulty of the game. So this is kind of like the director's cut, I guess. In videos and reviews that I've seen, everybody seems to agree that the 1943 Kai version of the game is the better of the two versus the original 1943. Unfortunately, it never made it over to the US in home form. The only home version released for 1943 Kai was on the PC Engine, and it's a fantastic title, and the soundtrack uses music from the arcade version, but I feel like it's really, really good on the PC Engine's sound chip. So, we're going to listen to Air Battle B from the PC Engine version of 1943 Kai. This came out a couple years later in 1991. Basically the same composers that worked on the arcade version, however, a lot of the arrangement was done by Daisuke Morishima. absolutely my favorite song from that soundtrack and from 1943 Kai as a whole. That was Air Battle B from the PC Engine version, released in 1991. That was composed by Tamayo Kawamoto. So jazzy, like, even though a ton of composers worked on all these songs, it sounds really cohesive. I think they just wanted to have a very flowy, jazzy feel to the whole thing. And this whole soundtrack is just so well textured. They picked really nice instruments for it. I'm so happy they went with that huge sampled snare. It just sounds so good against the synthesized leads. Quite a joy to listen to, and quite a joy to play as well. This is one of the most impressive PC Engine titles I've seen that isn't on CD. This was also the first Japanese home console game that was not ported specifically by Capcom themselves. It was Naxat Soft that programmed the PC Engine version. And Naxat Soft is great. Like, they made a ton of excellent PC Engine TurboGrafx 16 games, most notably the pinball titles, Alien Crush, Devil's Crush. Those are two of my favorite PC Engine / TurboGrafx 16 games. Fantastic music, fantastic graphics, smooth, fast gameplay. They really knew their way around the PC Engine hardware. So Capcom trusting them with their 1943 Kai Baby was a very, very smart choice. So only the first 7 stages of this game were based on the arcade version, and after you beat the Yamato battleship on the 7th stage, it shows a cutscene of the Boeing Stearman E-75 being upgraded with like futuristic weapons, and then you fly off to extra stages that were exclusive to this version, and it gets a little, I'm not going to say like it jumped the shark, I'm just going to say that it became a little less historically accurate after the 7th stage, but it got really cool as well. There's all new graphics, and the music for that was brand new as well and not ported from the arcade version, and exclusive bosses too. So all of the bosses, they kind of kept the whole romance of the Three Kingdoms aspect of the bosses, so you'll be fighting, Cao Cao or Liu Bei instead of having traditional Japanese names for the bosses. This is a title to definitely check out, whether you're playing it on a real PC Engine or an emulator. This is one of the games I got when I acquired my PC Engine probably 15, 20 years ago now at this point, and I didn't really give it much thought, because my whole opinion of this series was based on 1942 and it being kind of archaic, and I was not aware that 1943 Kai was so much fun and so much ahead of its time. So when I learned about this game and how good it was, I remember that I actually had it in my collection, and I was really pleased to be able to throw it in my PC Engine and play it on real hardware. So this is definitely not a game that I will be selling off at any point in the near future, because I just enjoy it way too much. So, defying all logic, the next game in the series was actually called 1941. They decided to go back 2 years in time for the third entry in the series. This one was released originally in 1990 in the arcades, and it did have one home port for the Super Graphics, which means that not a lot of people have gotten the chance to play it. It was an early Capcom CPS-1 title using the YM2151. It's the same chip that was in like Final Fight and Street Fighter 2 and stuff. This is Boss 6A from 1941 Counterattack, again released in the arcade in 1990, composed by Hiromitsu Takaoka, credited as Hifumi. interesting. It's like it's almost there, but it's still just a little rough. That was Boss 6A from 1941 Counterattack, again released in the arcade in 1990, composed by Hiromitsu Takaoka. To me, this sounds a lot like, I think it's one of the industrial area tunes from Final Fight. And so much so that I went to the Final Fight page on VGMDB to try to figure out who composed that particular tune, and ended up being Yoko Shimomura. So definitely not the same composer, but I feel like there's a lot of similarity between that track and this one. That kind of like rolling staccato bass was like extremely similar. So I don't know if there was any overlap or one person being influenced by the other. I just thought it was kind of cool, especially since it's the same sound chip, the same company, around the same era. I guess we'll never know. But anyways, 1941 moves the setting from the Pacific Theater to the Western Front in the North Atlantic Ocean. This is the first game where the second player played as a different airplane. So the first player gets your traditional Lockheed P-38 Lightning, and the second player would play as the de Havilland Mosquito, which sounds more annoying than deadly to me. But like I said, this game is a CPS-1 game, so it's a little bit more technically advanced. It's a little more fast-paced. You've got your same basic 2-button setup, shooting and bombs. There's no more fuel system, so instead of a constantly decreasing fuel supply, it's an actual energy bar, so you get 3 hits and you're dead. This also introduced to the arcade series a charge shot, so you can hold the shoot button down, build up a charge shot similar to like R-Type, and then blast the enemy. This was also a new feature that was introduced in the NES version of 1943, and so I guess they appreciated it on the NES and moved it over to the arcade version, which was kind of cool. Hiromitsu Takaoka worked for Capcom only for about a year between 1989 and 1990. It must be kind of a curse, like most of the 1940X series composers, at least early on, only worked for Capcom for like 1 or 2 years maximum. But while he was there, he also wrote music for both of the Japan-only Adventure Quiz arcade titles. He worked on Mega Twins and also Super Buster Brothers. He only worked on arcade games in Capcom's sound department. All right, so let's take a listen to the Super Graphics version of this soundtrack. This one was arranged by Funny Nari Nari and Happy. I don't have any context for these pseudonyms, unfortunately, but along with Hiromitsu Takaoka, credited as the original composer, these two were added to the roster as arrangers. So here's stage 6B, again from 1941 Counterattack on the Super Graphics in 1991. Alright, that was Stage 6B from 1941 Counterattack, released on the Super Graphics in 1991, composed by Hiromitsu Takaoka, and arranged by Funny Nari Nari and Happy. After listening to 1943 Kai and just how textured and rich that soundtrack is, this sounds a little bit thin. It's still well composed. It just sounds more like a traditionally average TurboGrafx 16 game. So even though the Super Graphics was a kind of beefed up version of the PC Engine with some extra RAM and processing capabilities, the sound chip remained the same between the PC Engine and the Super Graphics, so there's not going to be any additional music capabilities on this system. Even though I really prefer the sampled snare sound on the 1943 Kai soundtrack, I do kind of like that they toned the drums on this one down from the kind of overbearing snare and bass kick on the arcade version and kind of let those stronger melodies bleed through a little bit. I think that's really the strong point of this soundtrack, so yeah, I think it's very fitting for a shoot 'em up. Complements the game quite well. The Super Graphics version didn't really add too much or take away much from the arcade version. It was a pretty faithful port. The graphics were redone because most of these games are vertical-oriented arcade games, and that the arcade cabinets would have the TV turned sideways, so you'd have a narrower, taller playfield, which is, traditional for vertical shooters, and of course everything needs to be adapted for a horizontal home screen. Other than that, though, you're getting a pretty faithful arcade experience with the Super Graphics version of the game. Alright, so we're getting into the more high-tech stuff. This is one of my favorites, and probably one of the reasons why I decided to do a show based on this series. And again, I don't really know how to pronounce the title officially. It's 19XX, so I like to call it 19XDX. It could be 19XX, but XDX just sounds funny. So we're going to listen to Dance of the Green Gnome 1 from 19XDX, The War Against Destiny. This came out in the arcade in 1996. This was composed by Shun Nishigaki, and this was a CPS2 game, so we are listening to music from the quote-unquote Q-Sound arcade chip, which I will kind of break down in a little bit more detail when we come back. Alright, that was Dance of the Green Gnome 1 from 19XDX, The War Against Destiny. That was a 1996 arcade release composed by Shun Nishigaki. This was a great game, and this is where Capcom really started trying to add a lot of lore into the series. So this particular game actually takes place in a more modern setting with kind of a fictional war. So it's no longer the US versus Japan. This game tells the story of a terrorist organization named Outer Limits, and they've been causing conflicts in many parts of the world, and of course, being bad guys, they want complete world domination. So you play as two members of the World Peacekeeping Agency. Player 1 plays as Mark Rarato, and Player 2 plays as George Hamill. And throughout the story, you learn that Mark Rarato's older brother is piloting this mysterious black aircraft called the R-Blacker, which kind of taunts you as you play the game. Graphics are fantastic. Like I said, this is a CPS2 era game, so things are kind of like Neo Geo level in terms of detail and animation. Everything looks great. The music, of course, is fantastic. Shu Nishigaki is a very accomplished Capcom composer, so he's really showing off his chops here. Really interesting instruments. The bongos are right up front, and then there's like that Middle Eastern kind of nasally sounding lead instrument, which he uses a lot. He's worked on games like Cadillacs and Dinosaurs and Street Fighter Alpha, so if you're familiar with those soundtracks, I'm sure you'll probably hear some similarities in this tune to those other ones as well. As I said earlier, the arcade system that this game runs on uses the Capcom Q-Sound chip. This chip is so frustrating for VGM podcast composers like me, especially for music geeks, because there's like no information on this. It's like, oh yeah, it uses Capcom Q-Sound, and you're like, but yeah, but what is it? Is it FM? Is it wavetable? Like, what am I listening to? There's definitely some sample stuff going on here. You can absolutely tell that. But aside from that, there was no concrete evidence. So now that people have been breaking down the actual chips and taking dyed photographs of these chips on the Capcom motherboards, they were able to recently get some more information about what the Q-Sound chip actually is. So we're going to break for a little bit from the 1940X stuff, get into some music geekery here. And here's what I've found about the Q-Sound chip. Technically, it's called the Capcom Q1. The model number is the DSP-16A chip, and it's made by AT&T of all companies. I don't know of any other AT&T produced sound chip out there. It's entirely sample-based, so 16 channels of samples. Remember, last episode I talked about the Fast Tracker 2 was like 4 Super Nintendos smooshed together. Well, this is just 2 Super Nintendos smooshed together. It's pretty powerful, though. It can push samples as high as 24 kilohertz audio through its TDA 1543 dual-channel 16-bit DAC. So twice the sample channels of a Super Nintendo with a more robust sample size and quality. Plenty of room to create some really excellent tunes. And of course, like I said, if you've listened to the Street Fighter Alpha soundtracks, Super Street Fighter 2, all of the other CPS2 based games, you're gonna be familiar with the power of the Q-Sound chip. So, let's move out of the classroom and back into the arcade. This is where the 1940X series moved from being an influencer on shoot-'em-ups to being influenced by other shoot-'em-ups. So now we are looking at the ability to choose multiple aircraft. So at the beginning of the game, you can choose from 3 different ships, each of them having a weapon that's most suited to them. So the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, old standby, an old friend at this point. Of course, you're going to have that as one of the fighters. The de Havilland Mosquito makes a return, and aside from the standard 4 shots, 4 vertical bullets at once that the P-38 shoots, the de Havilland Mosquito starts with a 3-way shot. And then there's the newcomer, the Kyushu J7W Shinden, which is the fastest and most maneuverable ship It uses the super shell, which fires straight blue lasers. So as you can see, they are allowing the player to customize the experience to their own liking, and you're not just getting a single ship to fire your bullets with anymore. I think that's great, and also especially since this is more of like a story-oriented game, having the ability to choose the appearance and the skills of the plane that you're using kind of gives the player a little more ownership of that character. They also added grading to the series, which you basically get military ranks as you do well in the game. So you can increase your rank between 1 and 5 times between each stage, and you'll see like a military badge. You start off as a private, and then you can end up as like a, above a 5-star general by the time you were done with the game. So that adds a badge next to your initials on the high score table at the end of the game, which is pretty cool. This is a vertical screen game, again, very lush graphics, incredible animation, lots of variety of enemies and bosses and weapons. Super fun game. My second favorite in the series. There was one other composer on 19XTX, not as well known. His name was Tatsuro Suzuki, and I'd like to share a track from him as well. So, we're going to listen to a track from towards the end of the game. This is part of the Outer Limits base. This is Target 6 from 19XTX. Again, the War Against Destiny. Oh man, such a tense track. That was Outer Limits Target 6 from 19XTX, The War Against Destiny, released in the arcade in 1996. This one composed by Tatsuro Suzuki. Bongo-oriented percussion was very prominent in this soundtrack for some reason. And I like it. I like that decision that they made. I think especially if you were playing this in an arcade, those bongos would kind of really stand out, and they're so well programmed, they really feel like they're being played by hands, by a professional bongo, someone who's really studied the instrument. So hearing that as you're playing this game, I think would give you some energy, some musical, tribal energy to beat the Outer Limits. It sounds like you're trying to beat a Twilight Zone ripoff, but anyways, Suzuki was often paired up with Nishigaki for soundtracks, but his resume wasn't nearly as large. He also wrote music for many of the Street Fighter Alpha series games alongside Nishigaki, but he only worked for Capcom for about a year between 1995 and 96. So it sounds like Nishigaki was the only one that was able to escape the curse of the 1940X series. Nishigaki worked for Capcom from 91 to 99, so a good 8 years. He worked mostly with the Street Fighter II related CPS2 titles, but he ended up working on the first 2 Resident Evil games and Dino Crisis before he left Capcom at the end of the millennium. This is definitely a game to check out. Unfortunately, It was only an arcade release, so I think emulation is the only way you're going to be able to play it. It's available in MAME and a couple other arcade emulators. You can play, full speed, no glitches. It runs great on most computers. Same for our next game in the series. We are, again, going back in time from 19XDX to 1944. So this is 1944, the Loop Master. Kind of an oddity in the game series. It wasn't developed by Capcom. It was actually developed in conjunction with Rising/Aiding. They are shoot-'em-up masters. The other weird thing about this game is there are no credits available anywhere. If you beat the game, you see all your high scores, you see a little ending cutscene, and the game just ends. There's no credit roll, there's no nothing. I even went through every one of the arcade game files in a hex editor, trying to see if there were any credits kind of hidden in the data in plain text, which works sometimes, believe it or not. I have found composers that way, but not in this one. So we're going to have to unfortunately credit these two songs to an unknown composer. The other interesting thing about this soundtrack is it's got a very classic rock feel. A lot of southern rock, a lot of Doors, Jimi Hendrix inspired stuff, it's really weird for a game based in 1944. I don't know. I really enjoy it though. We'll talk a little bit more about it when we come back from it. So let's listen to Deep Blue Stage 1 from 1944, The Loop Master. This was an Arcade 2000 release by an unknown composer. Kind of hard to believe that was the same sound chip that was going crazy with the bongos on 19XDX. That was Deep Blue Stage 1 from 1944, The Loop Master, released in the arcade in the year 2000. Kind of an industrial rock tune. It doesn't really go anywhere, I just think it's a really cool loop. And to be playing a game in this series with music like this just feels really anachronistic. I mean, not that the other music was contemporary 1940s music, but at least it sounded traditionally video game, and so much of the music on this soundtrack is from a different time period. It kind of messes with your brain a little bit. I'm not exactly sure what they were going for with it, but it works. It just makes you scratch your head a little bit. This one was a horizontal screen game. It wasn't vertically oriented like most of the other games before it were, which is interesting. I guess it's worth noting. Fantastic graphics, fantastic animation. They got around a lot of the US versus Japanese controversy by using a fictional army as your opponent, and now you are flying as the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, and your second player is the Mitsubishi A6M0, which notably is the first and only time in the series so far where the player controls a Japanese fighter. So they've now teamed the two countries up to fight a common enemy. I thought that was pretty cool. Where 19XDX had one-hit kills, which was very annoying when I was playing through it, this one returns back to the energy gauge, where you can get hit multiple times before dying, but you only have one life to live. They really focus on the side fighters. Remember I said earlier in the show you get two little ships on either side of you that will help you out. You get side fighters like crazy, and you can collect them and kind of keep a stash of them so that as soon as your side fighter gets killed and you lose them, another one will pop right back out in its place. So as I was playing through the game, like towards the end of this one, I think I had like 67 side fighters in my backup cache. So it was basically like every single time one of them died, another one would just pop back up. I would get probably 3 side fighters per life and lose one. Very strange. The other weird thing about this game is the year and technology that it was released. It's a really late CPS2 title, considering that the last CPS3 title was released in 1999. Having this come out in 2000 almost seems like anachronistic in a way. There's a sequence when you beat the game that shows you each of the levels and stats about the levels, your percentage of enemies that you shot down, your score for that level, how many times you died, etc., etc. But the background looks like it would be a background for a staff role. Like they were going to add it, but then took it out and used that for your gameplay stats instead. I don't know. Let's play one more track from this game since I really like this soundtrack. This one has a little bit more of that 70s period feel that I was talking about. Let's listen to Battle of Green Field. This is from Stage 13, again from 1944, The Loop Master. So that was Battle of Green Field, Stage 13 by the Rolling Stones. Actually, I found out who composed the music, believe it or not, within this past 5 minutes that we've been listening to this track. It's Yasushi Kamanishi. I followed some breadcrumbs while I was doing some Google searches and ended up on his Japanese homepage. And he's got a company called Public Inc. And on that website, he's got a list of games that he's worked on. And it's all in Japanese, but 1944 The Loop Master is there plain as day and in English. Alongside that, I did some Google translation and also found out that he's worked on Gigawing, Gigawing 2, Mars Matrix, and a couple of other Capcom games as well. So, pretty cool. The Mars Matrix soundtrack is really neat. It's this kind of like industrial dance soundtrack, which I should play more from in the future because it's got some good stuff. So yeah, 1944's got huge bosses, as I said, very, very good graphics. It's a shame that it never ended up coming to any home consoles. Just like 19XDX, it's one of those games that you have to track down the ROM for and play in an emulator, but it's worth it. You will have a great time, It's got a ton of levels ranging from kind of normal historical stuff to some really weird futuristic stuff towards the end. All right, coming down the home stretch, we've got one more game to share, a couple pieces of music from it. Remember at the beginning of the show, I talked about 1942 Joint Strike. Well, this is a remake of the original game, which came out a good 25 years after the original 1942 game. This one was designed in California, not by Capcom. And that was a first for the series. It was developed by Backbone Entertainment for the Xbox 360 on the Xbox Live Arcade and through the PlayStation Network for the PS3. So, this music was composed by Norihiko Hibino, and he's got musical ties in both the US and Japan, so he was a great fit for this soundtrack. Let's start off by listening to Shinden Striker. This is from 1942 Joint Strike on the Xbox 360 and PS3. Yeah, see, now this is what I would expect a game based on 1942 World War II dogfights to sound like. Really cinematic, kind of orchestral sounding, inspired by the movies that would have come out around that time or featuring, World War II heroes. I like this a lot. I'm normally not a huge fan of this style of music, but I feel like the intense percussion really kind of draws me in. I'm a sucker for that stuff. I do feel like the melody might be a riff on one of the 1940 series soundtracks. I don't think it's that popular 1943 theme that we just talked about earlier, because we're going to listen to the one that's based on that next. That melody feels like a video game melody. Norihiko Hibino is not necessarily a Capcom employee. None of the individuals that made the game were. He was born in Osaka and graduated from Berklee College, which is a very prestigious music school in California, and then he moved to Kansas City to study jazz with authentic Kansas City jazz musicians. I thought that was really cool. He's bilingual, as you might expect from someone who's spent that much time in the States, so it's kind of fun to look up interviews with him. You don't get to see a lot of real composers who have studied both in Japan and the United States being able to speak without a translator, so it's fun to hear it directly from his mouth. He's appeared in Video Games Live several times with Tommy Tallarico. He plays the saxophone and obviously composes in several different styles. So really interesting composer. A lot of cool stuff that he's done. Worked on the Metal Gear Solid and Zone of the Enders games, Ninja Blade, which was an excellent game that nobody really talks about much, and contributed to the score for Bayonetta. He's done a lot of charity work too. When the earthquakes and tsunamis struck Japan in 2011, Hibino and a few other artists toured the affected areas performing free concerts to promote healing for those in need, which I thought was pretty nice. He has his own music company called Gem Impact, and he is an owner of Scarlet Moon Records as well. Cool stuff, and especially since this very well may be the last iteration of a 1942-based game. It's cool to see it go out with such aplomb in terms of music. The game is also kind of an amalgamation of a lot of the different games that came before it. It's got the health meter and the bomb system from 1943. It's got the charge fire and the water and sky-based sections that 1941 counterattack has. And it's got the level rank system from 19XDX, which is cool. It kind of took some of the best parts from each of the games and smooshed them together. The game is in 3D. The textures are kind of flat, like, it's an XBLA game, so it's not going to look the best in the world. It plays really well, though, and it's nice to have a game in the series that uses a true widescreen to fight your enemies with as well. So before we close out the show, we're going to call back to our pal, the 1943 Level 1 theme, with a track called Retro Blitz. This is a great orchestral remix of the 1943 game theme. So let's hit it. Such a great arrangement of that tune. That is a really powerful melody, and it's a shame it hasn't become more famous in the VGM spheres. I'd really like to hear people do like remixes of this theme. It's just so bombastic and heroic. Maybe it just came out a little too early for people to really catch on to it and have, good nostalgia for it. It's a shame, but it's a great track to go out on, to kind of reflect on the 1940X series and think about just how far video games have come. This series has gone from pre-NES, very simple beginning days in the arcade, to HD, Xbox 360, and PS3 systems. Who knows, maybe for a future anniversary of the series, they'll put something out for the PS5 or Xbox One. It's funny, if you look up 1942 or 1943 on mobile games, there are a ton of mobile game ripoffs. So it's definitely influenced a whole bunch of people. The shoot 'em up / fighting game arcade company Psycho also created a game called Strikers 1945, which I guess they kind of tried to shoehorn it into the 1940X series, but they never had a license. And it's weird. It's like a quasi-futuristic version of a game that would be in the 1940 series, but has no relationship to it whatsoever. I thought it was part of the actual series, but it was not authorized by Capcom at all. So, what are you doing, Psycho? I don't know. My favorite game in the series has definitely got to be 1944, The Loop Master. I've just had so much fun playing that one. Seconded only, I think, by 1943 Kai on the PC Engine. Because, it hits different when you're playing on real hardware. Plus, that game gets so ridiculously hard. Like, once you get past that 7th stage where they kind of outfit your ship with some futuristic stuff, enemies start flying around the screen like swarms of bees. It's insane. You need to memorize where you're going for sure, or you will never see the end of that game. There's a lot of cool stuff out there. There's a lot of games that you can purchase and play on your home systems. There's a lot that you have to kind of dig through and find the ROMs and play in, less official ways. But all of the games that I've talked about today, you could play at home on your TV or your computer screen. So I really hope you do decide to check some out. It's neat to see how much these games have influenced the shoot 'em up genre, and hopefully Capcom will wake up and realize that there's still some juice left in this series, and it would be really cool to see like a modern pixel art video game based on all of the World War II / sci-fi futuristic plane shooting that we've experienced. Oh man. So to wrap up, I want to remind you guys that we will be releasing on a more regular schedule. Like I said, probably not every 2 weeks, but it's not going to be like 2 months, 3 months between shows. I'm going to try to get at least one out per month for now, and look forward to the return of Embassy exclusive as well. Also, check out my other podcast. It's called The Arcane Machine, and my buddy Justin from the other VGM podcast, XVGM Radio, and I get together and share some of our favorite goth, industrial, and darkwave music. It's like a VGM podcast, but with cool, clanky music. We do a lot of synthwave, a lot of darkwave as well. So if you like electronic music and or rock and or alternative lifestyle stuff, I think you'll really enjoy it. I don't do Facebook much anymore. I've been much more active on Twitter, so please follow me at the VG Embassy on Twitter, or you can head over to thevgembassy.com and find a link to our Discord server, which is super popular and very active, full of a lot of very fun people talking about video games, video game music, everyday life stuff, all manners of geek and nerd fun. I have a blast there every day, hanging out with all my peeps. Speaking of peeps, we do also have a Patreon at patreon.com/thevgembassy, and I'd of course like to thank all of my Patreon patrons, starting at the tourist level with Bedroth, The Last Recon, Chris Murray, and Cam Giles. Our VG Emissary tier, we've got the Dyad, Metalman, Jordan Worm from the Table to Stage podcast, Mike Stark aka Ganon11, Chris Steenerson, and Chris Myers. Our audio attaché members, Dan Lawton, Scott McElhone, Carlos from the Heroes 3 podcast, Cameron Worma, Volt Supreme from Volt Supreme's Synth VGM Dream Stream Machine, and Ryan Steele. and our VG Ambassador tier, Mr. Frank Lee Zappa, and the patron saint of VGM podcasts, Alex the Messenger. Also, of course, I'd like to thank Trevin Hughes for our VG Embassy theme song, and Indira J, aka Metal Sorcery, for the amazing artwork on our website. Get ready next time for some hackin' and slashin' fun with my good friend and speedrunner Dan Lawton, and we'll be hearing from some new guests and some old guests going forward after that. So, stay good, stay safe, and we'll see you next time. Peace out, everyone.